The mansion stood like a monument to wealth, its marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of imported chandeliers. Each corner spoke of extravagance, rare paintings on the walls, priceless sculptures, carpets hand-woven from distant lands. Yet for all its splendor, it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that does not rest but rather presses down on a soul, reminding it of what is missing. At the center of this vast emptiness sat Ethan Gray, billionaire CEO of Gray Enterprises, a man whose face was as well known in the business world as the logo of his company. He was a figure who inspired awe and envy, graceful in power, precise in speech, untouchable in his decisions. His name was whispered in stock markets and printed on magazine covers. He could close a deal worth billions with a single phone call. And yet, as he sat at the far end of a long mahogany dining table that could seat 20, he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Before him lay a meal prepared by the finest chef money could hire: roasted duck with orange glaze, truffle risotto, handmade bread still warm from the oven. He picked at the food absent-mindedly, his fork dragging across porcelain without sound, his appetite dulled by the coldness that had seeped into this house. There was a place set at the opposite end of the table, wine poured, napkin folded, but as with so many nights before, it remained untouched. His wife, Celeste, was once the center of every headline, a socialite with beauty as sharp as her ambition, a woman who knew how to command a room. When they first married, Ethan thought her elegance and charm would fill the loneliness he had carried even while building his empire. But years had turned their union into a performance for cameras and shareholders. She was rarely home, her nights consumed with galas and society events, where she sparkled in diamonds and drew admiration from the wealthy elite. The love that might have existed between them had long since been buried under appearances, formalities, and unspoken resentments. Ethan stared across the long table at the empty chair, his chest tightening, as if the absence itself mocked him. The mansion was filled with everything money could buy, yet not with laughter, not with warmth, not with the simple joy of being seen and understood. He had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, commanded fleets of private jets, but here, in his own home, he was a ghost wandering through his possessions. He rose from the table, the scrape of the chair echoing loudly in the grand dining hall. Walking past towering windows that opened onto perfectly manicured gardens, he caught his reflection in the glass, tall, suited, commanding, and utterly alone. For a fleeting moment, he didn't see the CEO everyone admired. He saw a man trapped inside the prison of his own success, a man who had traded love for power, companionship for prestige. Upstairs, the master bedroom told the same story. Celeste's perfume lingered faintly in the air, though she hadn't slept in the house for days. Her dresses were gone from the wardrobe, packed for some endless series of events across the world. On her side of the bed, the silk sheets were crisp and untouched. Ethan loosened his tie, sat on the edge of the mattress, and pressed his face into his hands. His empire was vast, his fortune secure, but his heart was barren land. He remembered nights when he was a young man, building his company from the ground up, dreaming that one day his wealth would bring happiness. He had promised himself that once he succeeded, once the world knew his name, he would never feel the gnawing emptiness of his modest childhood. Yet here he was, at the height of success, plagued by a deeper hunger than any poverty had ever inflicted. The corridors of the mansion stretched endlessly, echoing with his footsteps. Chandeliers sparkled, but they gave no warmth. The art on the walls impressed guests, but it brought him no comfort. Even the sound of the ocean waves beyond the estate's high walls felt distant, muffled, like life itself was happening far away, behind glass he could not break. He wandered into the library, shelves lined with rare first editions worth millions. The fireplace crackled faintly, but the flames seemed to dance for no one. Ethan sank into a leather armchair and tried to lose himself in a book, but the words blurred before his eyes. What use was knowledge, power, or fortune if every night ended in the same suffocating silence? The staff moved quietly through the mansion, careful not to disturb their employer, for his mood had grown heavy in recent months. They had learned to tread softly, to keep conversations hushed, to bow quickly and leave him to his solitude. But behind their polite smiles, they knew what he did not yet dare admit aloud. The house was too big for one man's heart. Even as he sat surrounded by priceless possessions, Ethan felt a hollowness deeper than the silence of the mansion. It was not simply loneliness. It was the haunting realization that the life he had built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, had left no space for love. The empire he had sacrificed everything to create stood tall and unshakable. But within him, something fragile was crumbling. And so, every evening, as the city lights glittered in the distance, and the world admired the brilliance of Ethan Gray, inside his mansion he sat with the truth. He could no longer escape. He had everything, and he had nothing. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seemed to slip through walls and settle deep into the bones. Ethan had been pacing the corridors of his mansion restlessly, unable to quiet the disquiet in his mind. Sleep felt like a stranger to him lately, and the silence of the house was an echo chamber for thoughts he tried to outrun. He wandered toward the back of the mansion, where tall glass doors overlooked the garden, its hedges trimmed to perfection, its fountains whispering faintly in the moonlight. It was there, through the glass, that he noticed a flicker of movement. Curious, Ethan stepped closer. Outside, near the servants' quarters, a young maid had stopped mid-step. She was small in stature, with a frailness that the dim light could not conceal, and yet there was a strength about the way she carried herself. He recognized her face. Clara, one of the newer staff members, quiet and diligent, the kind who went unnoticed in the background of a wealthy man's home. Clara held a tray of linens in her arms, her eyes scanning the garden until they fell on the gardener slumped on a bench. The old man was clearly exhausted, his hands roughened by years of work, his shoulders hunched against the night air. His coat was threadbare, offering little protection from the biting wind. Clara set the tray aside, hesitated only for a second, and then did something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She slipped the worn shawl from around her own shoulders. A shawl so thin it looked like it had already given all the warmth it could, and carefully draped it over the gardener's frame. The old man stirred slightly but did not wake. Clara tucked the fabric around him with gentle hands, her face softened by a quiet tenderness. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching, did not seek thanks or recognition. She simply gave what little she had, and for a moment, it was as if the night itself grew warmer in her presence. Ethan stood frozen, hidden in the shadows of the window. It was such a small gesture, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of life, and yet it struck him with a force he could not explain. He had seen grand donations made at charity galas, checks signed for millions, speeches delivered about changing the world. But those were acts bathed in applause, performed under bright lights, surrounded by cameras. This, what Clara had just done, was different. This was pure, quiet kindness, the kind that asked for nothing in return. He found himself pressing a hand against the glass, as if trying to anchor himself to the moment. Memories of his own childhood flickered back. Cold nights when his mother had given him her coat, so he would not shiver. Mornings when neighbors with little to spare had shared bread with his family during the lean years. Back then, compassion had been currency. Kindness had been survival. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. He had buried those truths beneath contracts, mergers, and the endless hunger for more. Clara picked up her tray of linens again, pulling her thin blouse tighter against the cold, and walked back toward the house. When she passed Ethan in the hallway minutes later, she lowered her head respectfully, her footsteps quiet, her face betraying nothing of what she had just done. To her, it was an ordinary act, not worth mentioning. To him, it was extraordinary. That night, Ethan could not sleep. He sat in his study long after midnight, staring at the flames in the fireplace, replaying the scene over and over. The image of Clara giving away the only warmth she had haunted him, but not in a way that caused despair. It stirred something long dormant inside him, something softer than ambition, deeper than pride. He felt an ache he had not known in years, a longing not for wealth or power, but for the purity of a heart that could give selflessly even in scarcity. The next day, he found himself watching Clara as she worked. She moved quietly through the house, polishing silver, sweeping corners, tending to duties without complaint. There was no bitterness in her eyes, no envy toward the world of luxury she served, but could never touch. Instead, there was an honesty to her presence, a sincerity that made even her silence feel like a kind of grace. He overheard her once in the kitchen, humming a lullaby as she folded laundry. One of the cooks teased her gently, asking who the song was for. Clara smiled softly and replied that it was a tune her mother used to sing when the nights were too hard and the days too long. There was sadness in her voice, but also strength, a resilience that Ethan realized he had never cultivated despite his billions. The more he observed, the more unsettled he became. He was a man used to control, to numbers, to outcomes that could be predicted and measured. But this quiet kindness, this humble strength, was beyond his grasp. It demanded no recognition, asked for no return, and yet it held more power than all the contracts he had ever signed. One evening, as he sat in the library with a book open but unread in his hands, he caught sight of Clara again, this time carrying fresh linens up the staircase. She paused halfway, adjusting the heavy load. And in that small act of struggle, Ethan saw something that shook him more than any business failure or personal loss. He saw humanity stripped of all pretenses, unadorned and unprotected, yet dignified in its simplicity. He leaned back in his chair, his mind restless. For years, he had believed his life was built on the foundation of success, an empire forged from ambition, determination, and wealth. But now he wondered if perhaps he had built it on sand. Because here, in the quiet generosity of a poor maid, was something he had been chasing all his life, without ever knowing it. The following evening, Ethan sat once again at the dinner table, the same long stretch of polished mahogany gleaming beneath the chandelier's golden light. Across from him, Celeste finally made an appearance. She was late, as always, but tonight she carried with her the scent of champagne and laughter that did not belong to their home. She swept into the room in a dress of emerald silk, glittering earrings brushing her neck, her expression a mask of practiced indifference. "You didn't wait for me?" she asked, sliding into her chair with a clink of bracelets. "I did," Ethan replied evenly, his fork poised over untouched food. For over an hour, Celeste gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know how it is. Charity events don't end early. Important people don't like to be rushed. Important people." The words stung more than he cared to admit. He wanted to ask her who these people were, why they held her attention while he sat alone night after night. Instead, he set his fork down and studied her, the woman he had once believed would be his partner in everything. Her beauty was undeniable, the kind that demanded rooms to stop and notice. But it was a beauty polished for display, like a jewel under glass. There was no warmth in it, no softness left for him. "You didn't even call," Ethan said quietly. She sipped her wine, her gaze fixed on the crystal glass as though the ruby liquid within it were more interesting than her husband. "Ethan, you're always so dramatic. You know I have responsibilities. These events keep us relevant. Our name matters in those circles. Our name," he repeated. "Or your name." Her eyes flicked up at him then, sharp as a blade. "What exactly are you suggesting?" He held her gaze, unwilling to retreat. "I'm suggesting that maybe you care more about the way strangers see us than about what's happening inside this house." She laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Inside this house, what's happening here, Ethan?" Silence, boredom, dust settling on antiques. "Do you want me to sit around, waiting for you to come home from the office, talking about your meetings and mergers until I fall asleep?" "I need more than that. I need life." "Life," Ethan repeated, bitterness curling around the word. "And you find it at cocktail parties with people who don't know your middle name? Better than finding nothing at all here." She snapped, her voice rising now. "Do you know what it's like to be trapped in this mausoleum, day after day, pretending to be the perfect wife for the cameras while you're off playing king of the world? You built this empire, Ethan, but you forgot me in the process." Her words struck, but instead of softening him, they hollowed him further. Because deep down, he knew there was truth in them. He had poured himself into his work for years, believing wealth and status would nourish their marriage the way rain feeds soil. But instead, it had dried them both into strangers living under the same roof. Ethan's jaw tightened. "If you're so unhappy, Celeste, then why stay?" She leaned back in her chair, swirling the wine as if pondering a question too trivial for her energy. "Because divorce is messy. Because appearances matter. Because people like us don't just walk away, Ethan. We endure. We maintain the image." There it was, the confession without shame. Not love, not commitment. Image. Ethan rose from the table, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He paced to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond the glass. His reflection stared back at him, fractured by the glint of city lights. Behind him, he heard Celeste's bracelets jingle as she stood, her heels clicking across the marble floor. "You're being unreasonable," she said, her tone softer now, almost coaxing. "You know as well as I do that our marriage is more than us. It's about reputation, influence, the circles we move in. People look at us and see power. That's worth protecting." Ethan turned then, his voice low, controlled, but brimming with something she hadn't heard in years. "Power? That's what this is to you? Not companionship, not trust, not love, just power." She met his gaze with calm defiance. "Don't pretend you're innocent in this. You built your empire on power. Don't scorn me for valuing the same thing." For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing down, the realization that what lay between them was not a crack but a canyon. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that beneath the coldness there was still a chance to mend, still an ember of what they once had. But now he saw the truth in her eyes. She had chosen her world of glitter and recognition, and she would not leave it for him. And yet, even in the ache of that knowledge, Ethan's mind flickered back to the night before, to Clara standing in the cold, giving away her shawl, to her quiet strength, her unnoticed kindness. The contrast between the two women struck him with painful clarity. One giving even when she had nothing, the other clinging to everything yet offering nothing at all. Celeste placed her empty glass on the table, the sharp sound ringing like a final note in the fractured symphony of their marriage. She didn't notice the way Ethan's eyes lingered, not on her, but on the hollow space between them, a void no wealth or pretense could ever fill. The storm that had been brewing in Ethan's heart grew heavier in the days that followed. His conversations with Celeste became fewer, colder, until words were replaced by silence. The mansion, once a symbol of triumph, now felt more like a gilded cage. He moved through its endless corridors with the air of a prisoner, each chandelier and painting mocking him with their lifeless beauty. But amid the suffocating emptiness, his eyes often found their way to Clara. She worked quietly, her presence so unassuming it could easily have been overlooked. Yet Ethan noticed her now, perhaps because she embodied something that felt alive in contrast to the hollowness surrounding him. It was not the kind of notice bred from attraction or desire. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. One morning, as sunlight streamed faintly through the tall windows of the East Hall, Ethan walked toward his study and paused at the sound of muffled sobs. The sound was soft, desperate, and quickly stifled, but unmistakable. He followed it to the laundry room, a place he had never stepped foot in before. The door was ajar. Inside, Clara stood over a basket of freshly folded linens. She had her back to him, her shoulders trembling as she pressed a hand to her face. On the table beside her lay a crumpled envelope. She reached for it with shaking fingers, opened it, and read again, though tears blurred the ink. Her lips moved in silent prayer or pleading, though no words escaped. Ethan hesitated in the doorway, feeling a strange mix of guilt and concern. He had no right to intrude, yet something about her quiet suffering tugged at him. Clearing his throat gently, he stepped inside. Clara startled, hastily wiping her face, straightening as if caught in some forbidden act. "Mr. Gray," she stammered, her voice unsteady. I didn't hear you." Ethan glanced at the envelope still clutched in her hand. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she said quickly, Too quickly. She forced a smile, though it was frail and transparent. "Everything is fine, sir. I'll finish here right away." He could have let it go. It would have been easy to nod and walk away, to let her keep her dignity. But something in her eyes, red, rimmed, heavy with pain, would not allow him to turn his back. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "Clara, please, what's wrong?" For a long moment, she said nothing, torn between her instinct to hide and the weight of her burden pressing too heavily to carry alone. Finally, she lowered her gaze and whispered, "It's my brother. He's sick. The hospital bills, they're more than I can manage." She pressed the envelope to her chest, her voice breaking. "I work every hour I can, sir, but it isn't enough. He needs treatment, and I don't know what else to do." Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. Her words carried him back to his own youth, to nights when his mother had sat at a kitchen table with unpaid bills spread before her, her weary hands covering her face. He remembered the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer, while knowing you couldn't give them what they needed. "How much?" he asked softly. Clara looked up, startled. "Sir, the bills. How much?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. It was clear the question unsettled her, perhaps even frightened her. "I can't ask you for that. It's not my place. You've already given me work, and that's more than enough." Ethan shook his head gently. "You didn't ask." "I did. Tell me." When she finally whispered the amount, it struck him how small it seemed compared to the world he lived in. It was less than what he spent on a single dinner with investors, less than the price of one of Celeste's gowns. Yet for Clara, it was a mountain too steep to climb. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked toward his desk. He pulled out his checkbook, scrawled the number, added more, and signed. Returning, he held it out to her. Clara stared at the slip of paper as though it was something unreal, a vision that might vanish if she blinked. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much. It's not enough," Ethan said firmly. "Not for what he needs. Not for what you deserve. Please, let me do this." Her hands trembled as she took the check, tears spilling freely now. She sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed, her face buried in her palms. "You don't know what this means," she said between sobs. "You don't know how much this will change everything." Ethan sat across from her, watching her shoulders shake, feeling a heaviness lift from his own heart in a way he had not expected. For years, he had measured his success in numbers, in towers built and deals won. Yet in this small act, in lifting even a fraction of the weight crushing this young woman, he felt more alive, more human than he had in decades. Clara looked up at him then, her eyes glistening. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. Ethan searched for the answer, and in the silence that followed, he realized it was because of what she had done without anyone watching. Because he had seen her give away the only warmth she had on a cold night, not knowing anyone was there to notice. Because kindness, he now understood, was not measured in grand gestures, but in the willingness to give even when you have little. "You remind me," he said quietly, "of something I forgot a long time ago." She tilted her head, waiting, but he did not elaborate. The truth was still forming inside him, a revelation he could not yet put into words. What he knew was this: the empire he had built meant nothing without moments like this, moments where love, not power, carried the weight of life. The weeks that followed blurred into a season of change, though at first only Ethan felt the shifting undercurrent. Clara's brother received the treatment he needed, and each evening, when she thought no one was watching, she would slip into the small chapel near the servants' quarters to whisper her prayers of gratitude. Ethan, often restless and unable to stay confined to the hollow grandeur of his wing, would sometimes pass by and pause outside. He never entered, never disturbed her, but the sound of her soft voice carried through the wooden doors like a balm. He didn't need to understand every word to recognize sincerity when he heard it. In those quiet moments, he began to see her not merely as part of his household staff, but as a mirror reflecting everything he had lost in his climb to power. She lived simply, gave generously, and loved fiercely. Where his world demanded transactions and strategies, hers was built on faith and selflessness. It both unsettled and inspired him, pulling him into a space he hadn't entered in years. A space of vulnerability, of longing, of humanity. Celeste, meanwhile, grew increasingly impatient with him. His sudden withdrawal from their shared appearances did not go unnoticed. He began declining the endless galas, no longer interested in playing the part of dutiful husband on the arm of a glittering socialite. Rumors trickled through the city's circles. Ethan Gray was distracted, distant, perhaps unwell, when Celeste confronted him, demanding to know why he was jeopardizing their reputation. He told her the truth, though in words she had no interest in hearing. "I don't want this life anymore," he said one evening, standing in the grand hall as she prepared for another party. "The image, the performance, the empty rooms. I can't keep pretending." She turned to him, her eyes narrowing, jewels catching the chandelier's light. "You would throw away everything we've built. The empire, the recognition. Do you realize what people will say if you walk away from me?" "I've thought about what people will say for too long," Ethan replied, his voice calm but resolute. "And I've forgotten to ask what it is I need, what it is I believe in. Celeste, whatever this marriage was meant to be, it isn't that anymore. You want the world's approval. I want something real." The silence that followed was heavy, final. Celeste lifted her chin, gathering her shawl around her shoulders, and left without another word. Ethan did not stop her. He had already made his choice. News of the divorce spread quickly, filling tabloids and business journals alike. Shock rippled through boardrooms and dinner parties. The billionaire, who had once been half of the city's most glamorous couple, was now walking away, and whispers swirled about why. Ethan ignored them all. For the first time in years, he found he did not care about the headlines. What mattered was the strange lightness in his chest, the weight that had been lifted since choosing honesty over performance. Still, he did not expect what came next. One evening, after the staff had finished their duties, Ethan found Clara in the garden, kneeling among the roses, trimming away the wilted blooms with care. The dusk painted her face in soft tones, and for a moment, he simply watched. Then he stepped forward, his footsteps crunching lightly against the gravel path. She stood quickly when she saw him, brushing soil from her apron. "Mr. Gray, forgive me, I didn't hear you coming." He shook his head. "Don't apologize. You belong here as much as anyone." She gave him a small, uncertain smile, the kind that suggested she was used to being overlooked, used to moving silently through other people's worlds. Ethan took a breath. "Clara, there's something I need to say. You may not understand it at first, but I can't keep it to myself." Her hands fidgeted nervously in front of her. "Sir, I've spent my life believing wealth was the measure of success. That building an empire would fill the emptiness I carried, but none of it has mattered. Not the towers, not the parties, not the headlines. What has mattered, what has changed me, are the small things. The kindness you show without being asked. The way you give even when you have little. The way you live, Clara. You've reminded me of something I thought was lost forever." Her eyes widened, shimmering in the fading light. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," he replied softly. "Just know this. I don't want a life built on appearances anymore. I want one built on truth, on love, on the kind of generosity you've shown me without even knowing it. And if you'll let me, I'd like to walk beside you in that kind of life." Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hold them back. "You mean, after everything, you would choose me, a maid, someone who has nothing to give you?" Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You've already given me everything. You've given me hope. And that's more than all the wealth in the world." For the first time in years, Ethan smiled. Not the tight, polite smile he wore at business functions, but a real one, born of relief and discovery. Clara's hands trembled as he gently took them in his own, the roses around them swaying lightly in the evening breeze as though bearing witness. Word of their union spread faster than the divorce. Some mocked, others sneered, but many were astonished, even inspired. A billionaire choosing love over image, compassion over ambition, humanity over power. It was a story that could not be ignored. Critics called it madness. Admirers called it courage. For Ethan, it was neither. It was simply truth. The mansion, once so hollow, began to breathe again. It was no longer just a display of wealth, but a home touched by laughter and warmth. Ethan no longer sat alone at the vast dining table. The silence was broken by simple conversation, by gratitude spoken over meals, by the sound of a life shared. Where Celeste had seen servants as invisible, Clara saw them as family, and soon the household felt lighter, brighter, alive in ways it had never been before. And for Ethan, who had spent a lifetime chasing treasures that could never satisfy, the realization grew stronger with each passing day. The greatest wealth he had ever known was not in the empire he had built, but in the love that had finally found him.